Hello, ladies and gentlemen. How's it going? What if I told you that the CIA got its agents killed and all it took was one little Google search? I'd be like, wow, this has got to be one of the craziest stories that I've seen, or maybe an insane level of clickbait. And I tell you, ladies and gentlemen, it is not. To give you an idea, I wanted to talk about this for a fair bit, but there's actually quite a lot to the story that I feel needs to be relayed. Now, the CIA is the first, according to them, the nation's first line of defense. The Central Intelligence Agency is the US's primary intelligence agency, and they're one of the most feared in the world, right? Now, what if I told you there's many different ways to access CIA.gov? There's CIA.gov here, you can access it from the dark web, but what if you can enter in StarWarsWeb.net? And as soon as you hit enter, what if I told you it routed you to CIA.gov? Now, why would a website called StarWarsWeb.net guide you to the CIA? Well, what if I told you the CIA made 800 plus websites that all looked like the most innocuous websites you could ever have seen, all used by secret agents to send coded messages? Now, I was playing some Knights of the Old Republic earlier, and honestly, the inspiration for this video kind of just came out from a story that I heard like years ago. And I figured, I might as well just research and send it out on my channel, because to me, my channel is like a diary, and it's just something that's been on my mind for a while. Now, this is StarWarsWeb.net. Now, on the surface, you might be looking at this and thinking to yourself, it just looks like a standard website from 2010, Muda. They have Star Wars, Beyond the Unknown, May the Force be with you, Master Yoda's favorite games, like these games, you will. Master Yoda only plays Star Wars games, it seems. You got an Xbox, but you ain't playing no Halo 2, get out of here. So you want to be a Jedi. Lego ads. You basically have the ultimate 2010 core Star Wars website out there. Now, obviously, in amongst all these websites, there's so many other areas for you to kind of access. There are the message boards, Lucas Forums, Star Wars United, the Coruscant City Forums. And back then, the internet forums used to just look like this. You would have just thousands upon thousands of people posting about the movies, beyond the movies, the video games, so on and so forth. So, you're just somebody minding your own business, you're just checking the electronic games, for instance, and this is the actual official Star Wars forums. But to give you a quick idea, going back to some of those Star Wars websites, there was a way to secretly access a private network, a private portal for an actual CIA informant, agent, whatever. Once they would access this, they would be greeted with the option of entering a password. Now, while accessing Star Wars is a little bit impossible for now, there's another linked CIA website that kind of has this functionality, from my understanding, built in. One website that was caught under this domain was alljohnny.com, a Johnny Carson fan site. Anybody that doesn't know who Johnny Carson is, I really didn't know much about him too. That's because this is actually well beyond my time too. This was a late night host, comedic genius. And if you go to the submit your favorite Carson moment, one of the things that you would see is this little password. And I don't really have the access to this password, for instance, and honestly, I don't think anybody else really does. But generally, the idea is once you enter the right password, you would get sent to a encrypted CIA portal where you could post whatever you wanted to the CIA. Imagine you're like a spy, right? You needed to send your information. This is kind of like the digital drop site way of sending your information out there. And there were hundreds of these sites, like I said. For instance, did you guys know that rastadirect.net was actually owned, allegedly, by the Central Intelligence Agency? Yeah, somebody would connect to this website where they would learn all about Rastafari people, their culture, yada, yada, yada. But ultimately, inside this website was a secret way to access a CIA portal, and each of these websites would be assigned to a specific agent or a specific informant. So, of course, there were other websites too, like, for instance, recently the United States took, ownership, I guess you could say, of Venezuela, or at least basically took their head of state and are serving, or basically leading the government. Now, in this case, this is a website known as noticiascaracas.com. Now, if you actually look at this website, it looks mostly like a news website. But somebody would basically have access to this website and submit information, mostly from Venezuela. Now, if you ever think that the Delta Force took Venezuelans head of state that easily, it's probably because the United States has such a great intelligence network that they basically knew in and out what they had to do. And a lot of this was actually garnered by the vast network of informants that the CIA has all over the world. For instance, in China, eChess News would be one such website that would allegedly be used by CIA informants to submit information, obviously pertaining to the Chinese. as was sportsnewsfinders.com. Again, these websites looked pretty simple, right? They were just websites focusing on sports. But of course, that's what they had to look like to the average public. Because if anybody knew what was actually happening over here, then it would put some serious lives into danger. So yeah, that's pretty much just the gist of how it goes. Now, if you're wondering, but Muda, how does the CIA go about recruiting people like this? Well, you might actually be not so shocked, but early last year, like around May 1st, 20 million views were on this video, and you might be wondering, what is this Chinese video? Well, this Chinese video is uploaded by the Central Intelligence Agency, literally on government channels. And of course, these videos are high production masterpieces, one would say, basically asking Chinese officials to start leaking information to the Central Intelligence Agency. Hey pal, do you want to give up information? Do you want to expose Chinese secrets to the Americans? Well, here you go. And you think I'm joking? Like, I'm not even joking with you. They literally show people the CIA's website, not just the CIA's website, but what I can honestly imagine to be the onion link. They even actually have material to show people in China how to access the CIA via Tor. And it wasn't the only video they made too. There was other videos as well too of officials accessing Chinese portals. 14 million views. And it wasn't just the Chinese that they were targeting with this method too. There are other videos that target specifically the Russian Federation. And these videos have like 64,000 views. So clearly it doesn't seem like a lot of Ruskies are watching this shit, but a lot of Chinese people seem to gobble it. Or the CIA's viewbotting. Honestly, I don't know which one's worse. But yeah, the propaganda network of the United States is actually pretty vast. You may not know this, but the House actually passed back in 2024 a $1.6 billion bill. All right, $1.6 billion were diverted so that anti-Chinese sentiment could be spread all over the internet. Again, like the actual media here says, somehow it's a crime when Russia does it to us, but good information ops when we want to do it to discredit Beijing's Belt and Road initiatives worldwide. Now look, I'm not here taking a side. I'm actually Switzerland. I don't really give a shit about the US, Russia, or China in this case. Honestly, I think all these countries do a pretty spectacular job of fucking each other over on a goddamn daily basis. Have you ever seen the vast amount of cyber attacks that have happened between both nations? It's insane. But of course, obviously, this is a crazy situation to be witnessing. And of course, once you really show people how much money is spent in discrediting everyone around the world, it shouldn't necessarily shock you. But of course, I don't know how much of this is necessarily active, because obviously the legislation worked for things like the State Department and things like USAID, which we know are absolutely fucking screwed literally last year. But of course, all this aside, let's whittle on back to those websites. So those websites were used by CIA agents to effectively send coded messages or just send messages back to the Central Intelligence Agency. Now, how did these websites get agents killed? How did a Google search get the agents killed? Well, this is where Iran steps in, because initially they were the ones to discover the secret sauce behind these websites. So one of the websites, IranianGoals.com, which is inaccessible on their average internet, but thanks to things like the Wayback Machine, you can pull up an archive of this website. Now, Iranian Goals look like your standard sports website. In fact, it actually linked to a whole bunch of other sports websites as well. Some of these could be legitimate, some of these might even be part of the CIA network. But again, Iranian cybersecurity experts were eagle-eyed to notice that there was one search field down over here. Now, this wasn't necessarily a search field, this is actually a password field. How do we know this? That input would actually be a password, as you saw over here. Now, what somebody would do is they would put in a password and they would be sent to a login address. And actually, from a Reuters investigation, they did showcase what this would look like. So for instance, this applet would show up, you would log in, and then you would be given this little box right over here, where obviously the spy attributed to this portal would type their coded messages and then send them over to the CIA. So what they started to do is once they figured out how this code existed on this website, they did a technique that we call Google dorking. Now, this is not actually hacking. I want you to understand, the Iranians nor the Chinese actually hacked these websites. No messages were actually hacked. The portal wasn't grabbed into. But these websites, because they use the same parameters, right? The same code inside their website, Google dorking was employed to basically search and identify every single one of these websites. Now, the way these Google dorks worked, and the best way to kind of show you this method is to actually help you see how it exactly works. So this is exploitdb.com/Google hacking database. Now, this is a public registry of actual dorks that were added. So again, it's a little bit older. 2024 is kind of like the latest that we've seen over here, but it still gives you a really good idea of what to see. So for instance, this is a long string. Site github.com begin open SSH private key. Now this is actually a dork, and the way that a dork works is when you go into a search engine, you can type in a bunch of extra parameters, right? So you can actually have the search engine identify and look into fields like in text or whatever, in title. And once you actually start searching the web this way, you can look for things that normally wouldn't have been found in a traditional human language Google search. So in this case, by searching for this, you're basically able to scour github.com for somebody potentially leaking their private open SSH key, which if somebody does do this, and some people have, it completely violates a lot of their encryption, completely invalidates in a lot of cases the messages that they've been sending out. So of course, obviously, you could possibly do this with OpenAI API keys, but you get the idea. You can search for a lot of stuff that you probably shouldn't be getting into. Again, Google dorking is not illegal, nor would I even classify it as hacking. I would probably call this as OSINT stuff, right? Which is, again, just searching for things on the internet. There's a lot of cute OSINT tricks that you can bring up, and ultimately that's what the Iranians did. So for instance, let's say somebody who was accessing a website known as havenofgamers.com. Yes, this was allegedly another site in the CIA network that was used by an informant. So the way that this would work is, let's imagine somebody is just filling in or sending information. There's a reason why this method is not totally stupid. You might be like, why would the CIA make it? It just sounds really stupid, Mutahar. No. The reason why it's actually good is because if you use things like, for instance, VPNs, or if you use things like the Tor relay, connecting to the dark web or using a VPN when anybody is actually assessing you at the ISP level, which is what a network would do, which is what a government would do. If you're using VPNs or you're using Tor, that while they might not be able to see what you're doing on the actual system, while everything that you're doing is encrypted, the fact that you're using those technologies is basically a giant red fucking flag that says, yeah guys, I might be a fucking agent. It's why I always say when you use all these anti-privacy tools, you get put on a watch list. Because realistically, you're actually putting a giant billboard on yourself that says, yeah, I'm hiding something. I have a reason to hide something. There's a reason I'm going through a million steps to protect my privacy. So ultimately, what the CIA did was they had to devise a method where people who were in these countries, right, like places like Iran, for instance, could go on to havenofgamers.com. So Iran would just sit there and think, oh, this guy's a fucking gamer. He just wants to play video games. When in reality, he's connecting to these websites and literally just sending information to the Central Intelligence Agency. And in some cases, because they would be on these websites that would probably be used by a bunch of people too, like sports websites, they could kind of blend themselves in, right? It served a lot better. It would obviously be pretty shocking if the same IP address kept accessing the same actual website over and over again during very weird times. And that's ultimately one of the ways that these guys ended up getting caught. It wasn't that their information got leaked or messages got leaked. It was the fact that metadata was the shit that tipped these agencies off. Even if you use public computers or whatever, the information you were giving off just by browsing the internet was enough to actually put flags on certain users. There's actually another method that just happened very recently where Amazon busted a North Korean hacker who they had hired. A North Korean IT worker was working at Amazon, and the only way that Amazon uncovered it was when they noticed that his keystrokes had a delay. So at some point, they were tracking a 110 millisecond delay, which is pretty massive on the keyboard, and it led Amazon to think, oh, maybe this guy is not from where we hired him. Maybe this guy is from places like North Korea. They launched an investigation and found out just through this little bit of metadata leaking, this little investigation, that the guy they hired wasn't exactly the person they expected. So it's these tiny things that give you away. And when you're actually facing against a country's nation-state hackers, which, remember, these are some of the best hackers in the game, some of the best intelligence people in the game, their whole job is to track other fucking agents. So they're able to track people that are probably as good as them, people that are trained to be able to cover their tracks. And in some cases, when the Iranians figured this shit out, and when they found out that they could basically figure out every other website, because the CIA used the exact same code, the exact same identifier, so they were able to Google dork and figure out every single one of these sites. So it's a simple matter of basically, once they identified the site, they could see who was accessing it, or they could basically identify, the errant patterns around them. One of those errant patterns was a man known as Ghulam Reza Husseini, and this is a pretty disgustingly dark story here. So in 2010, when he was leaving from Imam Khomeini Airport, he was preparing to go to Bangkok, and in Bangkok, he would meet a CIA handler who would basically take him from there. Now, literally before he could even leave the country, he had to pay his exit tax. But at that moment, at the airport, the ATM machine actually marked the card as invalid. And at that moment in time, he was literally grabbed by a security officer. So Hosseini said he was brought to an empty VIP lounge and told to sit on a couch that had been turned to face a wall. Left alone for a dizzying few moments and not seeing any security cameras, Hosseini thrust his hand into his trouser pocket, fishing out a memory card full of state secrets that could now get him hanged. He shoved the card into his mouth, chewed it to pieces, and swallowed. And you bet he had to swallow that card, because if they found the SD card on him, plugged it into a computer, figured out what he was taking out of the country, that would probably not be him getting hanged. It would probably be him getting tortured first, then probably having a bullet put into his head. That's how freaky this situation is. Back in 2006, a former CIA contractor by the name of John Reedy actually was punished after warning of a catastrophic failure in the agency's operations. And he basically knew that it was a recipe for disaster and they had a catastrophic failure on our hands, to the point where he was identifying that there was actual misuses and we needed to actually change things before people got in trouble. And while a lot of the actual top secret information is still heavily redacted, he does talk about it pretty extensively, and it does make sense over here. He was worried about what would happen. The damage would not stop with the identification of our human assets. Our method of operation made no sense, but it now placed our officers in jeopardy. So this is a long, it's a 27 pager that you can read, and while there's a lot of redactions, I still think you can pull a lot of good stuff out of this, and it's definitely a good little piece of record to show that the CIA should have absolutely known this ahead of time. And again, this was referenced by Security Affairs, who said that, when Yahoo published it, they talked about John Reedy, who warned the CIA that they were using an insecure communication method in 2008, and then in 2010. And then, of course, he was fired by the agency because he just wouldn't shut the fuck up. And ultimately, remember, this is really bad for the CIA, because ultimately the way that their organization can work is if they're able to at least provide some semblance of safety to their actual assets on the ground. If the assets on the ground suddenly start feeling that the CIA is willing to sell them out or not give a shit about them when they're doing such high-risk work, why even bother to work with them in the beginning? So if you are somebody who wants to spy against the Chinese, let's say you're a Chinese national and you watch those CIA videos, you might be like, shit, maybe I should speak up against my government. Just remember, America's not going to have your back if you actually get into the shit. They'll probably drop you as faster than you can actually expect. It'll blow your mind. And of course, when you look into, again, even further into how far the reach goes, one write-up by MrOnline.org writes in when he talks about, things like USAID. For instance, Oksana Romanyuk from the Ukrainian Institute of Mass Information warns that nearly 90% of her country's media outlets rely on funding from USAID. Now, I don't know how much USAID is really effective these days, after the whole Trump stuff. But to give you an idea, a lot of the money that America infiltrates around the world when it's into journalist systems or building websites, it has to really make you think about how much of their actual money is there to, how much is it the US being altruistic, and how much of it is the CIA spreading its intelligence network around the world, right? So yeah, one Google search was what led to, again, an entire network of US operations basically being brought into the light. Now, what makes this even more scary is Iran was one thing, but it actually completely fell apart when it came to China. So the way that they write this up is a firewall was used, this is according to Business Insider, used by the CIA to communicate with its spies in China, compromised the identities, and contributed to their executions by the Chinese government. Several current former intelligence officials literally told the actual Foreign Policy magazine. So for anybody that doesn't know, in a 2-year period, Chinese officials started accurately identifying spies working in the United States. Now, the number's a little bit wild over here, but generally it's understood that over 30 plus were killed or actually captured by the Chinese for basically being fucking informants against their country. Now, obviously, China is, and most countries are usually scared of this, don't get it wrong. If a Chinese spy gets captured in the United States, I think some of them probably go through, like some level of fucking like courts. But I'm pretty sure a lot of them pretty much just get their fucking like lights turned out as soon as they get identified. And this goes pretty much the same for any country that's, people are spying. If you're a spy in a foreign country, you know it's high risk as hell because immediately when you're captured, you're not treated with the same level of rights that an average person would be treated. You're already there with the worst of intentions. They're going to fucking kill you. The internet-based system brought over from the operations in the Middle East was taken to China under the assumption that it could not be breached and made the CIA invincible. You know when people tell you, we can't get hacked, nothing bad's gonna happen, expect the fucking worst. That's when it always happens. So ultimately, nobody really had to hack anything. The Chinese had shown incredible speed and accuracy, basically identifying every single one of these websites, whether it be primarily by Google dorking or other methods they had. But once they identified these sites and figured out who was basically pinging them all the time, they were able to accurately identify who was spying on them and basically kill them as soon as they got there. So basically, one Google search, if you really think about it, got over 20 agents, informants, whatever, killed in the process, basically making this one of the CIA's biggest blunders in history. And the thing about this blunder is the CIA doesn't actually really want to acknowledge it because, like in their words, they don't like to comment on these actions at all. So it makes you wonder if they're actually still using similar methods, obviously with a lot more care put into it, simply because it's not a bad method if you think about it, right? It's only really a bad method if you get caught, which is exactly what happened. And that really happened because the CIA just didn't put enough effort into actually uniquely identifying or making these sites look different in the grand scheme of things. So really, when you look at this method, you think, okay, having like one of these sites that blend into the rest of the internet seems pretty cool, you know? It's like kind of having an unlisted YouTube video and sharing the link on like a super private Slack so people can get like video messages, maybe without sharing it, hiding in plain sight kind of stuff. But ultimately, it was really the fault of the CIA when they couldn't accurately like hide each and every single one of these websites. And when it took a bunch of Iranians to find this, I don't know why the CIA didn't decide to maybe switch things up or really reassess this method, because reusing it again in China against an adversary that is far more technologically advanced, no disrespect to the Iranians, but China just has a lot more resources to throw. I don't know what the fuck the CIA was expecting. Really, the death of these informants, and a lot of these informants really probably just wanted the best. Maybe they were given some kind of a deal, to get out of the country, but ultimately when they got caught, the CIA didn't do shit to help them out. They didn't even send a strike. They didn't care. Once you get caught, the CIA is like, whatever, we don't give a fuck. You're dead. It's the coldest shit you've ever seen in your life. That's the kind of stuff that happens. So think twice before you work with any 3-letter agency. Doesn't matter what country, none of them have your back. And ever since then, it appears that the CIA has just tried to rebuild their network, but obviously it's just not as easy to do. Because again, China is an advanced, also adversarial country too. So again, this stuff happens all over the world. There's spies everywhere. But when it comes to some of the biggest countries in the world, the shit you see will blow your fucking mind. Why would the CIA make a Star Wars website? Yeah, because it's hiding in plain sight. Until, of course, you make such a grave mistake that getting exposed, all 800 plus of your websites getting exposed, not just by counterintelligence agencies, mind you, but a lot of this stuff could have been discovered by, again, just private researchers like from University of Toronto's Monk School. And again, they even say it, using only a single website as well as publicly available material such as historical internet scanning results, we identified a network of 885 websites. So again, they were working with internet archives. Imagine if they had the real enchilada to play with. They even say, had we conducted the research while the servers were still online, as China and Iran likely would have, we would not even have needed to rely on the Wayback Machine and other tools. Knowing only one website, it is likely that while the websites were online, a motivated amateur sleuth could have mapped the CIA network and attributed it to the US government. So yeah, it's pretty much the entire story. You know, it gets a little bit long-winded, I agree, but I have to give you every aspect of this tale. Because really, just telling you and showing you these websites does a disservice to the entire tale. To show you, right? Like, obviously, it's a pretty ingenious method, you know? Obviously, you could ask, why not just use the dark web, or why not use other methods? I'm sure that those methods are more used nowadays, but obviously the hiding in plain sight to basically give an extra layer of security and obscurity to your agents out in the field is kind of a smart thing to do, right? Until, of course, you use the same headers and data types on all of your websites, and you basically have shit exposed. Once one domino fell, the rest fell too, and that was pretty much game over. So, you know, ultimately, it is one of the biggest blunders of the CIA, and this is a story that, you know, got a bunch of informants and agents killed in the process. And all of it happened through Google dorking, or at least primarily through it. Once the Iranians could figure out a bit of code, they were like, all right, let's just use Google, find all these websites, and then boom, tell your actual team to go out on the ground, get in the cars, load up the rifles, and start whacking agents. Really the craziest shit you'll ever read, man. You know, it's one of those things. I read literally, and just to top it off with the video, I keep reading stories about like the US hacks China, or the Chinese hacks the US like government emails. And I feel like cybersecurity stuff, you know, it's like once you've seen one hack, it's whatever. Once you start looking into the blunders of intelligence agencies and their plays with computers, shit will shock you. If you like what you saw, please like, comment, and subscribe. Dislike if you dislike it. I am out.